Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us live today with Dr. Jessi Sigander. I am just setting up our Facebook Live, so give me 1 second while I do that, and then we will get started. People are filtering in. This is one of our biggest webinars for all of you that are attending in terms of attendance, so I'm excited about that. We have 2 more left this summer. Next week, I will be interviewed by Jessi actually on how to protect your kids from predators. And then the final week, I'll be interviewing Dr. Steve Tracy about the church's response to the Me Too movement. So let me just do a brief introduction to Jessi here. Jessi has her PhD in education. She has her undergrad in education. She has her master's in education. She's an education guru. She and I have actually known each other since we were really young, and now we're not. So we have walked a lot of this journey that she's going to share with you together, and we've both ended up amending the soul together, which is kind of exciting. But she has taken her knowledge of education and trauma and done some pretty amazing things with it in regards to learning disabilities. So I'm excited to have her share about that. Tell me about your first teaching experience, Jessi.
I'm so happy to be here, but I just chuckle because I don't feel like I'm an expert at anything. But these trauma and learning are the two things I'm most passionate about in my life, hands down. So I'm thrilled to be here today. So I finished college and started teaching at an alternative high school. It was just really God that opened the doors for me to be there. And I was 21 and had no idea what I was doing. But it was a high school for kids in the inner city who had been kicked out of public school, and it changed my life. I fell in love with the kids. I fell in love with their stories. I did not know what trauma was. I was still a kid myself. I had grown up in a small farming town. But what I knew was that, and what I learned quickly was that if you made a connection with a kid and you valued their story and you loved and respected them, only then would they begin to learn for you. And it changed really my heart for people, for kids, for trauma, for just opened my eyes to a lot. And yeah, it was very, very impactful.
Talk to me a little bit about some of the challenges you saw in your students.
Yeah, I mean, we had kids day to day that showed up that didn't have a place to live, or had their own kids, or were, living on the streets, or had just been in a drive-by gang shooting, or had just been beaten up by their parents the night before. And so they came into class every single day, not to learn, but to try to find a safe place in between four walls. And so there were so many days that I spent with kids, just talking to them, listening to them, hearing their stories, goofing off with them, making connection with them. It wasn't until they could trust me that I could begin to look at their learning. But I had kids in high school that were reading at a first grade reading level. Mm-hmm. I had kids in high school that had never picked up, I taught English and history. I had kids in high school who never had picked up a book before. I had kids in high school who couldn't write a complete sentence. Mm-hmm. So I was too young to know that there was a connection, really like a neurological connection between what was happening in their life situation and in their brain. But I knew that they couldn't learn until they felt safe and cared for first.
So you've said before and kind of said a little bit ago that experience changed the trajectory of your career. Tell me how so.
I realized I didn't want to work. Well, it changed everything. I mean, it really gave me a heart for seeing people where they were at. I think I probably would have gone on to teach high school and taken kids at a face value. And they walk into my classroom, I get to teach them, they walk back out. And it changed the way I looked at each student I had to understand who they were and that their story was important. That dictated where I taught in the years after. That dictated the kinds of kids that I had in my home. That dictated, a desire for us to stay connected to our students, to, even after we had left them. That dictated, inviting teenagers into our house and, taking on college students to live with us who had had trauma and teenagers who had had trauma. because I realized there's such a value in them. And I don't know that I would have seen that or known that if I hadn't had that experience with those first kids.
Yeah, I agree. Tell me about, so fast forward, you have your first daughter. First of all, I think everybody needs to know you're a voracious reader. How many books do you read a week? I read a lot for the compared to the average person.
I read a whole book last night. I read 3 or 4 books a week. Reading is my escape from my life. I read often.
So it's and your kids like did book on tape before they could read. So it's a huge part of your family culture, your personal life. So tell me about, you have 2 kids, your daughter's was she in 2nd grade when this was discovered, 4th grade?
Well, so when she started kindergarten, I mean, we're a reader, we're at the library every week. One of my big things for my kids is I wanted to raise them to love books and to love learning. That's so important to me. And, I remember in kindergarten sitting down with her and, like, okay, let's learn to read, and going through the ka, a, t. She'd be like, I don't know. And I was like, ka, over and over. And just thinking, like, okay, I have really high expectations of what she can do. I'm a high school teacher. She's a kindergarten. She'll go to school and figure it out. And she did. She went to school. She began to read. But I did notice that I just kept thinking, maybe I have high expectations of what this should look like. Her spelling was horrible, but I thought, well, you're kind of learning it. Her writing was not so great. You're kind of learning it. And then in 2nd grade, we sat down, she and I, to read a book together. And she was starting to get a little bit more into chapter books. And the book was in front of her, and she kept doing this with her eyes. And I said, Ella May, what are you doing? And she goes, oh, when I do that, it helps the words on the page not move around as much. And I went, oh, no. I think I know what this is. And so, of course, first we took her to the eye doctor because I thought, I really hope it's an eye issue. And it wasn't. And we started going down the exploration of, could this be dyslexia? Both sides of my family have strong histories of dyslexia. My husband's side of the family, which unknown to us at the time, has a strong history of dyslexia. And we started walking down that path. And it was an interesting path to walk down. She had a fabulous teacher that year, but her teacher kept saying to me, well, she's not dyslexic. She doesn't switch her letters around. And my mom instinct went, something's not right. And the school district we were in does not screen for dyslexia. So we took her to an educational psychologist and had her screened. And the psychologist said, if you hadn't been a teacher, you probably wouldn't have picked up on it because she has already figured out coping mechanisms and what she can do to cover up for the ways that she struggles. And we got a diagnosis for her for dyslexia in 2nd grade. And I remember grieving, like crying. I just wanted to go to college. And my husband was like, this does not mean, you're freaking out. But it was a long path to get her accommodations that she needed and tutoring that she needed and all that kind of stuff.
Right. And so it was a trauma. What was happening between the siblings? Because Ella's brother does not have dyslexia and is very bright.
Yeah. So Ella has a younger brother.
Right, but he does not struggle with school at all. Yeah.
So what we began to see with Ella, which by that time I had started to go through, I'd gone through Mending the Soul. I wasn't working for them yet, but I understood a little bit more about what trauma was. It was becoming more of a buzzword. And for her, there was so much trauma around going to school every day and feeling stupid. So she had a younger brother who's extremely bright, who by kindergarten was reading chapter books already. And she would say, like, I can't, why, it's so easy for him. What's wrong with me? Like my brother that's 3 years younger can do everything I can't do. He's better at spelling. And him, not in an unkind way, but she would ask how to spell something and he would spell it for her. And she would be devastated. Like, I can't spell it. I'm so stupid. And 3rd grade was a horrendous year for her. And looking back, I now know every time she walked into school, she wanted to fight or freeze because she felt dumb. She couldn't do things like everybody else could. It took her longer to do the rest of the assignments. She spelled things wrong on posters that were going to go up around the classroom, and kids made fun of her. And just began to recognize a ton of shame that she had around her dyslexia and who she was.
And so at this point, because you are who you are, you start doing a ton of research and figuring out how to solve this problem. And you discovered something that can be done to help her, but really it also exposed this whole new world of trauma therapy. So I think it's important to say at this point that Ella did not have trauma, that her dyslexia is not related to trauma. There was trauma related to the dyslexia. But for a lot of people, including the kids that you taught in the school where you taught, these learning disabilities, trauma can cause them or trigger them or can look like them. So tell me a little bit about, well, first, why don't we first talk about ACE scores, which we did a webinar, our very first webinar was on ACE scores with Robbie, who is our program director for Vulnerable Child. But for everybody here that doesn't know what that is, can you just tell us briefly?
Yeah, so ACEs is the Adverse Childhood Effects Survey. It was a study done with 17,000 adults, and it is a survey of things that might take place in your childhood, such as divorce, having a parent that's an alcoholic, being abused. And the study was instrumental in changing how we view trauma. And they found that the higher your ACE score, so it's a score of 1 to 10, the more likely you are to have higher levels of obesity, heart disease, cancer, depression, suicide. But what we know now, as more research has been done, is that the more a child has been exposed to some adverse things in their childhood, the more likely they are to have symptoms that look like learning disabilities in the classroom. So a child that has an ACE score of 4 or more, which on average, 1 in 4 kids in your class in a classroom has an ACE score of that. Okay, so an ACE score of 4 or more, they are 32 more likely to display symptoms of learning issues. So learning differences and emotionally irregulated behaviors in the classroom. So there is a huge link between what happens to a child and how they can learn and how their brain processes information as they grow up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to say that statistic again. 1 in 4 kids has an ACE score of 4 or higher, which means that they are 32% more likely to suffer from learning difficulties in the classroom. So that's huge. That's a quarter of our school population. Neurologically, I'm going to pull up, you gave me some slides. Neurologically, this is what you were able to discover about learning, and now what you help people with in your side gig. You're going to walk us through how trauma changes the brain and tell us specifically how these things, are those your slides on the screen?
Yeah, okay. Go on up to slide number 1.
Screens up, so let me go up here. So these are the parts of the brain. Do you want to walk us through this here?
Yeah, so Dan Siegel does some great research around the brain and what happens to the brain. And he uses the hand. It's kind of the example of what the brain looks like. So our wrist is kind of our brainstem. It's what connects the body to the rest of our brain to the rest of our body. It sends our signals. The bottom part of my thumb is kind of what is where it's responsible for fight, flight, and freeze. It's also what protects us. When we pull the thumb in, it's really our amygdala. And this is the connection between the upper and the lower part of the brain. It regulates us, it helps control us, it helps us with communication. And then this is the upper part of our cortex. And when it wraps around the thumb, it becomes our prefrontal cortex. And that's really important. That's actually this part right here that we see at the front. And it's the logical reasoning part of the brain. So it's what makes sense of our world. It helps us rationalize what's happening around us. As kids, it helps us understand what's going on around us. And it hugs over our brain, and it's really important. And when trauma happens and a kid goes into fight, flight, or freeze, we call it flipping their lid. Okay, and so they're no longer processing information and using rational thinking because their lid has been flipped. Instead, they are using only their fight, flight, or freeze, so their emotions, to understand, to react, and to think through what's happening to them. That is a huge thing that we see in our classrooms all the time. This looks like, so fighting, I mean, when a kid's lid is flipped, they're fighting. So that could be punching the kid in line next to them. That could be hitting, that could be kicking, that could be verbally fighting back against you. Fleeing, it's the kid that pops up out of their seat all the time, runs away in the classroom, runs away, down the stairwell. And then freezing are those kids that you ask a question and you call on them and they literally freeze. They look like a deer in the headlights. And for our brain to function rationally, right? Like we need to be able to use our prefrontal cortex, and trauma triggers our prefrontal cortex and makes us pop our lid. Okay. So that's kind of what happens to the brain. Now, the bottom point I have here, when experiences are traumatic, the pathways getting the most use are those in response to trauma. So when there's a lot of trauma, your brain begins to get stuck in fight, flight, or freeze. Okay, our rational thinking isn't always there. Even when you're no longer in fight, flight, or freeze, your body has walked down that pathway so many times of being in fight, flight, or freeze that it just kind of gets stuck in this position. And again, we're not working with children or people or adults that are thinking rationally. We're creating pathways in the brain that automatically go to fight, flight, or freeze rather than letting the brain be where it should. This reduces the formation of other pathways needed for adaptive behavior. So, our brain is supposed to be walking down this pathway over and over and over again to process information, to learn how to read, to learn how to write, to learn how to regulate our behaviors. That's the pathway we're walking kids down all the time in school and even before they get to school. But if this is the pathway that we find them in over and over and over again, there's going to be issues in how they learn and how they regulate their behavior.
You have it on the slide, and I think it's so important to note that imagination is completely short-circuited when there's trauma happening, and when the lid is flipped and cortisol and other stress hormones are being pumped through that kid's brain, that part of their brain is completely shut down. So imagination, play, enjoyment, all the things necessary for a positive learning environment are completely gone. And I think
there are different things that can, triggers can, anything can flip a kid's lid. It can be a loud noise that triggers them. It could be, a smell that triggers them. It could be, they didn't have breakfast at home. It could be the words their mom spoke to them on their way out the door. I mean, there's a lot of things that can cause a kid's lid to flip. What we need to know as parents and as teachers is that drastically changes how they're able to process information.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, here's your next slide.
I'll just read through some of the couple of these. On the whole, neuropsychological studies tend to show that children who've experienced or witnessed violence, trauma, or abuse, or neglect do experience cognitive difficulties in one of these areas. So compromised executive functioning, that's like the ability to look at a homework assignment and have an idea of how long it's going to take them. It's spatial awareness. It's kind of if I need to get from point A to point B, the steps that are there in between. For those kids, those steps are often missing. That's executive functioning.
Almost like a stroke victim.
Yes. Difficulty regulating arousal levels. So that's, if Joey kicks Susie and Susie's lid is flipped or has had a lot of trauma, her reaction to that small kick could be off the charts. Well, she's not really reacting to the kick. She's reacting to everything else that's happened inside of her. Difficulty with attention and memory. So such interesting studies right now around ADHD. Several studies talk about how the symptoms of ADHD often look very much like the symptoms of a child who has had trauma. And that we oftentimes will, if a doctor's doing due diligence, they will ask the family and discover the child's ACEs score, because they may come in having issues with focus, with memory, with behavior, and it may look very much like ADHD. It may not be ADHD. It may actually be a result of trauma. So those need to be treated very differently, right? One needs an ADHD medication, most likely, and one needs the tools available to deal with the trauma that's happened to them. Distinct patterns of social information processing. We see, again, the neurological pathways are different. Reactivity to sensory stimuli. We talk a lot about this in one of the classes that I teach. As a teacher, we may have a bell that we ring, or we may flash the lights off and on, or we may have this something kind of, turn on to get your kids' attention. Well, to some kids, that sensory overload can trigger them. And so it's being aware of the kids you have in your classroom or the kids that you're volunteering with. watching them, observing them to know that some things can just send them through the roof that you may not have thought of before. Compromised language development, including difficulty in comprehension. And that is a huge one. We see kids who struggle to read, and specifically kids who struggle to comprehend the information that they're reading through. Effects. What does this look like practically in a classroom? Lower GPA, higher rates of absences, dropout, more suspensions, expulsions, of course, if you are having outbursts, decreased reading ability, lots of physical symptoms of what you might see for a kid in the classroom. It's the kid that always has a stomach ache, or the kid that always has the headache, poor control of emotions, unpredictable behavior, the ADHD that I was talking about. It's an overreaction to bells, to doors slamming, to sirens, to sudden movements, blowing up when being corrected by a teacher or a principal, fighting back, like automatically going into that fighting stance when they're criticized or teased by somebody. And then to the kids that really struggle through those transitions, right? When we're moving from a normal classroom to a special, or when something changes in our routine, they kind of just lose it. That's kind of what it looks like very much in a school environment, what those things can look like for kids.
Okay, so you have done some work on, you have a side business where you help adults and kids who have learning disabilities kind of create new pathways for learning through a technique called neurological reorganization.
The neural organizational technique.
Okay. Should have written that down. So you've been doing that, and I know you've had some really interesting experiences. Why don't you share a few of those that you feel comfortable sharing?
Yeah. So twofold here. One, we know that trauma affects the brain, right? And there are a couple different ways to combat that. One thing I do want to say before I get into the rest is that we know with the ACEs research that one adult that cares, right? A teacher, a parent, a friend, one adult that cares can actually be the thing that changes the trajectory of a child's life, right? So they could be the thing that helps to regulate the child and change the neural pathways in a child. We stumbled upon the neural organizational technique. I have an uncle who has severe dyslexia, and he spent a good portion of his life trying to figure it out. And he discovered the neural organizational technique and said, I don't know what this is, I can't explain it, but it really changed my life. So we did a bunch of research in it, and it is a technique where you look at the neural pathways that are in the body, and you see which ones are disconnected. And disconnections happen for lots of reasons. So disconnections happen because of trauma. Disconnections happen because of a genetic predisposition. Disconnections can happen because of a concussion. And you slowly and surely just start to reconnect all those neural pathways again. And it's been so interesting. We saw massive gains for our daughter. I explained to people a little bit, like, for a person with dyslexia or learning issue, your brain has been driving on the side streets. You're still getting from point A to B. You're still doing all the things, but there's a lot of twists and turns, and it often takes a lot longer. And we're saying to your body, hey, there's a quicker way. Get on the freeway. To get from point A to point B. And we've seen, huge gains, and it's been fantastic. What's been really interesting is to see the people that come in to do a consultation with me who don't have dyslexia or weren't diagnosed with something in their childhood, but something has shifted later in life, and use the same protocol with them to look at the neural pathways, but oftentimes trauma has caused the neural pathway to be disconnected. So we work to reconnect it, and so that your brain can work the way that it's supposed to work, so that you can comprehend information, so that you can read fluently, so that you can process through the information that's given to you. And it's been super interesting, and it's encouraging to know, right? Like, if a child's brain has been wired in one way, that our brain is magnificent, and that we can make new pathways, we can make new connections, but it does take information, and it does take people that care, that are involved in kids' lives.
I think it's been interesting, as you've shared stories of that with me, that you're able to tell sometimes where the trauma occurred, like if it was a car accident or a hard birth or rape, the parts of their bodies that don't respond to what you're doing, what they're supposed to respond to, are those parts where they were hit or where they were abused. I think it's fascinating. So that treatment is very specialized. Not everybody's going to do what you're talking about,
Yep.
the neurological thing. But you are going to tell us some things we can do for our kids and our teens who might have a learning disability or for whatever reason, right? Like this is
Yes.
good for somebody that has like an actual learning disability or
Yes.
somebody whose trauma is mimicking one, right?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about them separately. I'm going to talk about them from a parent point of view and then also from a teacher point of view. So first from a parent point of view, so talking as a parent who has a daughter who has dyslexia, who's doing fabulous in school now. But I get parents all the time that call me bawling because their kids don't want to go to school. We call them the Sunday night meltdowns. Their children have anxiety, they are stressed out, they don't want to be there, they're not happy when they get home. And so much of that, I think as a parent, I had to learn, it has nothing to do with me. It has to do with the fact that she's going back into a place tomorrow that she is going to go back into fight, flight, or freeze. And she is stressed out and she is overwhelmed. So there are some things we've done in our home. When we use the feelings chart, it's in our Mending the Soul workbook, but I actually printed it out and hung up in our fridge so that even if she didn't have the words, she could point to the face to tell me how she was feeling. We sat down with her and I said, Ella, this is hard. Like, this is hard. This is not an easy thing. And had lots of conversations around what it means to feel dumb or to feel stupid or to feel different. And lots of conversations around, I said to her one day, I'm like, Ella, it's not, God didn't just wake up one day and go, oh shoot, Ella has dyslexia. Didn't see that coming.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he created you and this is part of who you are. And he wants to use your story in other people's lives. Mm-hmm. And I said to her, I'm like, you have developed such a skill of resiliency and seeing people for who they are because you know that it's not always easy. So I'm like, you have this beautiful gift of seeing people that may not always fit in or may struggle, and you're aware of that and you can meet them where they're at. We also, when she came home from school it took so much for her to hold it together to try to look like she could do everything, even if it was hard. That when she came home from school, we just implemented like the first hour, we do nothing. We're not going anywhere. We're not seeing friends. And she would need to go in her room. She's an introvert, and turn on an audiobook and paint and just have the space to be a mess. We implemented personal health days. I said, listen, I need mental health days in my own job sometimes. But I said, once or twice a semester, as long as we're not trying to miss like a massive test or something, if you wake up and you need a mental health day for your own sanity, take the mental health day. So just knowing your child well enough to know what you can do to help them deal with their anxiety, to validate their emotions, to give them the words. I said to Ella, I'm like, you can always come home and say, Mom, it was a horrible day. It was a crappy day. Like, you can say that. And I'm like, and sometimes when you can't say that, I can see that in your behavior. But knowing that so much of that wasn't personal, it was just taking everything out of her to hold it together. So I think giving them words and validating where they're at is, and connecting them with other people, is really important for Ella to get a diagnosis. And she said to me, at least I know why it's hard. I thought I was stupid, but now I know why it's hard. And then to connect her with other kids and to be able to say, look, these are other kids that have the same struggle. These are ones that are, years ahead of you in high school. These are ones that are, younger than you. You guys you're in the same place. You understand each other, and giving her that safe place where she could have those conversations with people, because her dad and I don't have dyslexia. And so wanting to get her connected in that community. As a teacher, there's a lot we can do, or as a Sunday school teacher, or as a counselor, not for all the things. So when we're working with kids who have a learning issue, whether it's because of trauma or not, one of the best things we can do, especially for kids who have trauma, is to develop regular rhythms. So a child who has a high ACE score, who's coming to school and is struggling every day, oftentimes they don't know what's going to happen next in their day. They don't know who's going to be there when they walk through the door. They don't know where their next meal is going to come from. They don't know who's going to fly off the handle at them. And so giving them a consistent schedule, one that they can see, one that they know they can count on, and then letting them know, like, hey, today the schedule is going to be a little bit different, or hey, on Thursday it's Monday, and on Thursday we have we have an assembly that's coming. Just so you know, things are going to be a little bit different. Offering them as many choices as possible. So many times kids who have trauma they feel like their lives are out of control and don't have choices. So even if it's, hey, we have 15 minutes left in class, do you want to finish your math homework, or do you want to sit at my desk and we can chat for a little bit? You know, giving them as many choices as possible. Connect with them, listen to them, get to know them, let them know they're valued, let them know that they are somebody beyond their behavior. You know, I always say kids don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. That's hard in a huge classroom in a high school with hundreds of kids, but it's really important. Grounding, you know, teaching the kids how to be aware of their body and what's happening in their body. This can be done in so many ways. Grounding helps when our lid is flipped. Grounding helps our lid be put back on. And we can use grounding by just identifying the 5 senses. And so sometimes I do this with my own kids when their lid has been flipped because life hasn't gone the way they wanted. But in a classroom, it's as simple as, you know, having them turn to their partner and use their 5 senses right now, or to write a paragraph about their 5 senses, or, you know, even for a kid who's not able to use their senses right away, saying like, hey, I'm going to put on a song, let's sing together, or did you hear this, you know, ambulance go by, or whatever. Just trying to get them aware of their senses so that they can be aware of their body, and their brain can kind of calm down a little bit. Using feeling charts, I talked about that. Be sensitive to triggers. Again, you know, you might be doing something that you think, you know, turning on a loud music to do something, maybe, you know, how you want to run your classroom, but it may be actually the thing that triggers a child. And then as a whole, you know, we hope in our school system that traumatized children are going to get all the resources that they need. While a traumatized child might not meet the eligibility criteria for special education, if you know your kids and you are connected with them, and you know that they have a lot of trauma in their life, there are things you can do practically. You can shorten some of their assignments. You can give them additional time to complete assignments. It's going to take their brain a lot more time to process the information if their lid is flipped than it is when they're using their, you know, executive functioning and they're thinking clearly and reasoning the way that they should. Giving them permission to leave the classroom, you know, finding a safe person that they can go to if they get really emotional or become overwhelmed. Give them additional support when they're doing assignments. And then in as much as possible, helping to educate the parents. You know, we have these kids for a short time, and if the parents are open to it, giving them the tools that they need and can use through the resources at your school or your church to give them education. I love this quote. I don't even know where I picked it up from, but it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. And knowing in a classroom environment or in a church environment, it's not personal. It's not personal. A kid flying off the handle, or a kid messing around, or a kid running it has nothing to actually do with you. And being able to step back from that.
I think it's so key. Our kids' behaviors very rarely, unless it's an extreme circumstance, are related to their lack of respect for us. I think more often than not, our reaction to that is related to our need to control them. And kids need autonomy just like adults do. And childhood from birth to adulthood should be a progression of autonomy and independence. And I think as adults that have the power to influence kids, it's key for us to understand that their behaviors are actually about them and not about you. You might be exacerbating the situation if you're trying to like control it. You can't control that. But I think that's key. Talk to me a little bit about vulnerable child curriculum and how it addresses all of this stuff, because Mending the Soul saw a need that was not addressed within the Mending the Soul basic stuff, and then go.
Yeah. So vulnerable child, we really have 3 kind of prongs to it right now within Mending the Soul. So vulnerable child is a curriculum that was created for kids who have had trauma of any type. or kids who you want to build resiliency in. So maybe they haven't had trauma yet, but we all know that it's going to happen somewhere down the pipeline. And we have kind of 3 prongs to it. So we have a whole set of curriculum. So if you want to be a vulnerable child facilitator, you can take the curriculum, you can run it in your church, you can run it in a small group, you can run it in your group home, anything like that. We have a set of a curriculum and a class that we do just for parents. So if you want to take the curriculum and use it with your children, which I personally have, and it's phenomenal. It gives a lot of words and vocabulary to your kids that they may have never had before. We do offer a course for that. And then most recently, we have come out with a course called the VC, the Vulnerable Child Educator course. And I love it so much. I love it so much. It's a course for anybody that works with kids or volunteers with kids. So social worker, police officer, teacher, Sunday school teacher, youth pastor. Kids have trauma. That is the world we live in. And so we look at how does trauma affect the brain? How does it affect learning? What does shame look like in children? How do you combat shame? What are some of the effects of abuse you might see in children? How do you combat the effects of abuse? We look at resiliency. We look at how do you really practically, how do you handle maladaptive behaviors in your classroom or in your group home or in any situation that you come into. And we also look at how do you take care of yourself, because as a teacher or a social worker or somebody who's on the front lines with kids who have trauma, we can get compassion fatigue pretty quickly. And so how do you take care of yourself in the process? It is much less of a faith-based course than we've ever offered before within Mending the Soul. Because we want to reach the masses. We want teachers to have this information in their hands. And what I love about it too is that we not only ask teachers to learn about their kids or people that go through the course to learn about their kids, but we ask them to do some self-reflection. And so just as you're learning about the trauma that's happened in your kids' lives that you work with, you're looking at yourself and understanding what trauma have I had, whether that be an illness or a divorce or whatever that is. How has that impacted me? And then how does that impact me as I go back out to work with these kids? What kind of defenses do I have? What kind of triggers do I have? What makes me flip my own lid? How do I put that back on? Just really practical tools that we use to educate people about kids and trauma. And it is my heart. It is everything I love about Mending the Soul and education combined into one.
Good. Anything else that we haven't touched on that you think is key for people to be aware of? And while you think about that, I'm going to open the question and answer area. If anybody watching has questions for Jessi, you can click on the Q&A button or type it into the chat box, and she will be able to answer those questions.
I think that I mean, one of the things I would say as a parent of a child that has a learning issue, no one's going to advocate for your kid as much as you will. So don't think that the school, not that the school is a bad place at all, but don't think the school is going to advocate and necessarily do all the right things for your kid. As a teacher, I would say the same thing. If you have kids in your classroom who have learning issues, whether it be because of a learning disability or because trauma has, opened something up for them, nobody's going to advocate for that child like you can as a teacher. And so it's not one of those things that, you can just pass off and assume the school is doing all the right things. I would highly encourage you as a parent to know your rights, to know what you can ask for. We had schools say to me several times, we don't do that. And then I could say, but I am a teacher and you legally have to. And they're not kind of used to that pushback. So, find a group, find advocacy places in your area, get connected, and do what's best for your kid.
I agree. No questions? I'm shocked. All right, guys, if any questions pop up, feel free to type them on our Mending the Soul public page on Facebook or our Mending the Soul facilitator page on Facebook. Jessi's in both of those and can answer any questions that you have there. I'd be happy to answer them too. If you've been touched by Mending the Soul or anything that we offer, I encourage you to go to our website and click the donate button. We do rely on donations to make the wheels turn on this bus. And so we ask that you consider that when you are thinking about giving to organizations. Next week, we will be talking about how to protect your kids against predators. I really encourage you to share that widely on your own social media channels. It's important information, and I hope to see many of you there. And then one more week until after that, until Dr. Tracy is with us. So all of those registration links are on mendingthesoul.org/webinars. Thank you everyone for being with us today, and we will see you next week. Thank you, Jessi.
Thank you.